Office clerk handed Elena Morozova her eviction notice without lifting his eyes. His pen continued scratching across another document, as if she were already erased from the Gallatin Valley in Montana territory. Elena stood motionless. The paper quivered faintly in her grip, but her expression did not change. Through the smudged window behind the clerk, the mountains rose, cold, distant, unmoved. She had learned that same stillness in Russia, where weakness threw predators of every kind. 6 months after Ivan died of typhoid, his land claim reverted to the territorial government. A new claimant, someone she had never seen, wanted the property before snowfall. She had 17 days to leave the sod house she and Ivan had carved into a hillside. 17 days to dismantle the life they had built. 17 days before winter sealed the valley shut. Outside, thin October sunlight washed over Bozeman Gulch. The main street lay rutted and muddy, lined with false-fronted buildings that advertised civilization in a land still ruled by wilderness. A cluster of women stood outside the general store, heads bent close. Their voices faltered when Elena stepped into view. She heard them anyway. "That's the Morozova woman. Her father died on the crossing from Russia. They buried him at sea. Her mother last winter, coughing blood. And now the husband. Black widow. Cursed." Elena kept walking. Her boots struck the boardwalk, then sank again into mud. She did not turn her head. Shopkeepers found reasons to disappear indoors as she passed. 6 months of this. 6 months of being treated like contagion. She had $42 in coin, a team of oxen, no kin with 800 miles, and soon no home. The prairie grass had already browned under the first hard freeze. Winter in the Gallatin Valley was not a season. It was a sentence. Arctic air swept down between the mountain ranges, dropping temperatures far below zero. Storms could bury a cabin for days at a time. She and Ivan had survived 2 winters in the sod house. He had cut the wood. He had packed snow against the walls. He had been warmth beside her when the wind screamed. Now there was only quiet, and whispers to fill it. She found Josiah Harwick outside his general store, overseeing the unloading of freight. He was lean, gray threaded through his beard, eyes sharpened by decades of frontier survival. When others had turned away, he had not been kind exactly, but he had been fair. "Mrs. Morozova," he said, tipping his hat. "I need supplies," Elena replied, "and bricks." He paused. Bricks. Fire bricks, for a stove. The morning temperature had settled at 28 degrees and showed no intention of rising. Josiah drew his coat tighter. "I have 400 common bricks in stock. Fire bricks would need to come from Fort Benton. That's 3 weeks' freight minimum." He studied her. "What are you building?" "I found an abandoned trapper's cabin 8 miles up the valley. I will claim it and survive the winter." "Alone?" The word carried its own warning. "Alone." Josiah shook his head slowly. "Mrs. Morozova, determination is one thing, but winter here." He stopped. "I have a cousin in Helena, boarding house, honest work. I could arrange passage on the next freight wagon." He was not mocking her. He had buried families who misjudged this valley. He knew what happened when hope met 40 below and lost. "The bricks," Elena said again. "Will you sell them to me on credit?" He searched her face for a long moment, weighing something unseen. "If you overwinter in that cabin, you'll burn 8 to 12 cords of wood. That's cutting and hauling daily. Strong men fall behind that demand." "I know," she answered. "That is why I will not build an American stove." She told him about the pech, the Russian oven her grandfather had constructed in villages near Novgorod, a massive brick heart that burned hot once each morning and held its heat for a full day and night, a stove that consumed a fraction of the wood required by iron boxes common in Montana. Josiah listened without interruption. When she finished, he rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "I have never heard of such a thing," Josiah said slowly. "A stove that holds heat 24 hours from one fire. That sounds like wishful thinking, Mrs. Morozova. Heat dissipates. That's basic physics." "Not physics," Elena replied evenly. "Thermal mass." She reached into her coat and pulled out a scrap of paper, already creased from folding. With a carpenter's pencil, she began to draw. Rectangles for bricks, lines for channels, arrows to show the path of smoke. "The masonry absorbs the heat," she explained. "It releases it slowly. The smoke does not go straight up a chimney. It travels through channels, surrendering its warmth to the brick before it escapes. My grandfather built these stoves for 40 years. They work." "Your grandfather was in Russia," Josiah countered. "This is Montana. Cold is cold, Mr. Harwick. Physics does not change because the language does." He studied the sketch, then her face. Whatever he saw there gave him pause. He lowered his ledger and spoke more quietly. "Mrs. Morozova, I will tell you something I have not told anyone in this town. My daughter, Cordelia, is in trouble." Elena said nothing. "She's with child, no husband. By summer, everyone will know." His jaw tightened. "I've watched this town decide who deserves mercy and who deserves exile. They call you cursed because it's easier than admitting they're afraid. I won't be part of that anymore." He snapped the ledger shut. 400 bricks, on credit. You can pay me when you prove me wrong. Prove them all wrong. And maybe when you do, my Cordelia will too. In Russia, Elena thought,
There was a saying, "A warm house is a prayer God hears." "I am building a warm house," she said. "That is my prayer." She folded the paper carefully and thanked him. She was halfway down the boardwalk when his voice called after her. "Mrs. Morozova, why did you come to me? Everyone else crosses the street when they see you." She turned. The late light struck her face. Grief carved, wind burnished, stronger than beauty. "Because you do not believe in curses, Mr. Harwick," she answered. "You believe in mathematics, and the mathematics says I need 400 bricks." He laughed once, sharp, startled. It was the first laugh directed at her, not about her, in 6 months. That night, Elena lay in the sod house that was no longer hers. Wind combed through the grass roof with restless fingers. In 17 days, strangers would sleep beneath it. They would never know about the initials Ivan had carved into a beam. They would never know the place by the door where she had stood each evening, scanning the horizon for his returning shape. She closed her eyes and traveled farther back, across ocean and continent, to a village outside Novgorod, where snow ruled 7 months of the year and cold sharpened the air to crystal. Her grandfather, Alexei Morozov, had been a master stove builder. In memory, he was always dusted in brick powder, hands rough as bark, eyes bright with a craftsman's certainty. "Come, little one," he would say, lifting her so she could peer into the firebox. "Bricks," she would answer. "Not just bricks, possibility. Each brick holds heat, each channel guides smoke. Together they become a system, a machine for turning wood into warmth, if you understand how they speak to one another." She had watched him build 17 stoves before she turned 12. She learned to mix mortar, judge clay by touch, calculate flue lengths for maximum heat extraction. There had been no son to inherit the knowledge, so it had passed to her. Her grandfather knew something of whispers too. After famine took his wife and sons, villagers murmured that God had marked him. He answered by building a stove for the poorest family in the village, a father too sick to work, 6 hungry children. That winter, while others shivered and rationed wood, that family stayed warm.
The next year, he built 3 more, then 7. By the time Elena was born, no one remembered the curse. They remembered the warmth. "They will name you," he had told her once. "Cursed, unlucky, worse, especially when you stand alone. But knowledge, what lives in your hands and head, that is yours. Build for them. Build until they cannot deny you." Elena opened her eyes. The wind had quieted. Somewhere beyond the sod walls, a coyote called. 17 days. 400 bricks. One woman who refused to die on schedule. She would build. The abandoned trapper's cabin sat 8 miles up the valley, pressed against a hillside that shielded it from the worst of the north wind. Elena found it on October 16th, after a day of searching and reluctant directions. It was worse than she hoped, and better than she feared. 14 by 16 feet. Poorly chinked logs gaped with daylight. Canvas stretched over the window openings had rotted thin. The door sagged on leather hinges. The stone fireplace had collapsed into rubble that swallowed a quarter of the floor. But the roof held. The floorboards were sound, and the cabin caught the morning sun. She filed a squatter's claim that afternoon. The clerk who had served her the eviction notice stared as if she had chosen madness. "You understand this gives you no protection until you improve the property," he said. "Anyone can contest it." "I understand." "You also understand the last occupant froze to death there when his wood ran out during a blizzard." "I understand that too." He stamped the paper with a shrug. In his estimation, winter would settle the matter. Elena moved into the cabin on October 18th with her oxen, $42, and her grandfather's knowledge. She brought tools from the sod house. Shovel, pickaxe, saw, hammer, and wooden forms for shaping bricks. The first task was clay. She found it along the creek bank a quarter-mile away. Dense, smooth, laced with just enough sand. She dug until her shoulders burned and her palms split. Bucket after bucket. She hauled the clay back on a rough sledge. Dig. Haul. Dump. Return. The rhythm steadied her. Each load brought her one step closer to a stove that could hold back Montana winter.
Each load was a declaration. She was not cursed. She was prepared. Each bucket weighed nearly 30 pounds. The creek lay a quarter-mile away. She made 40 trips that first day and fell asleep without supper, too exhausted to feel the protest in her muscles. On October 19th, she built brick molds from the scrap lumber of the collapsed fireplace, 9 inches by 4 by 3. She mixed clay with chopped grass for strength, packed the forms, and laid the bricks beneath canvas to cure. By the 23rd, 200 sun-dried bricks rested in rows, and she had hauled all 400 of Josiah's stock bricks to the cabin on credit. The fire bricks would line the firebox and inner flues, where heat would climb past 800 degrees. Her handmade bricks would form the outer mass, built not to endure flame, but to store warmth. She tore out the ruined fireplace and dug a 4-foot foundation pit in the corner where 2 walls met. The stove would stretch 7 feet long, 4 feet deep, rising 6 feet before narrowing into a chimney. 4,000 pounds of brick and mortar, nearly a quarter of the cabin's floor. It would keep her alive. Reverend Ezekiel Crane rode out on October 24th, gray mare picking through the mud. He spoke gently of prudence and humility, of knowing one's limits. Taking work in Helena is not failure. It is wisdom. Elena kept mixing mortar. In Russia, she replied at last, clay streaking her hands. A warm house is a prayer God hears. I am building a warm house. That is my prayer. He left unconvinced. 3 days later, Thaddeus Whitmore arrived. Former Army scout, skeptic, practical man. He expected foolishness. Instead, he found engineering. The half-finished stove rose 4 feet from its foundation. Smoke would travel through a maze of channels, 43 feet of turns and drops, before reaching the chimney. He traced the pattern with his finger. Turbulence increases contact time. More surface area. More heat transfer. He glanced at her. Your grandfather was doing thermal engineering before anyone named it. Will it work here? She asked. In theory, he said carefully. Yes. It was not encouragement. It was respect. On October 25th, she woke to the sound of breaking clay. 50 of her curing bricks lay smashed outside the cabin. 2 nights later, someone poured water over the rest. By morning, 30 more had frozen and cracked. Small boot prints marked the frost. She told no one. Instead, she worked longer hours, moved the curing bricks inside, slept lightly, knife within reach. Whoever wanted her to fail would not get the satisfaction. By November 4th, the stove stood complete. 7 feet long, 4 feet deep, 6 feet tall. Her hands were split and bleeding. Her back throbbed without relief. 4,000 pounds of defiance. Tomorrow she would light it. Before dawn on November 5th, with the temperature at 19 degrees, Elena built the first fire. Kindling laid in careful lattice. Split pine for quick combustion. The goal was heat. Intense and immediate. Flames took hold. Smoke slipped into the flue. For 20 minutes, it worked. Then the smoke reversed. It poured back into the cabin, thick and choking. Her eyes burned. Her lungs seized. She staggered outside, coughing, as gray clouds billowed from the open door. Failure. She sat on a stump, soot streaking her face, and watched her hope drift into the morning air. Thaddeus rode up soon after, drawn by the smoke. He examined the stove in silence, running his hands along the masonry, checking the flues. When he emerged, he did not look triumphant. The structure is sound, he said. The mortar held. The channels are clear. The smoke came back into the room. He nodded slowly. That's not a design flaw. She looked up. It's a cold chimney problem, he said. When you lit the fire, the flue was full of frozen air. Cold air is heavier. The smoke couldn't push through it, so it came back into the room. Then the design is wrong. No. The design is right. For a stove that runs constantly. In Russia, the chimneys never froze solid. Here, you must prime it. Prime it. Light a small fire at the chimney base first. Warm the air column. Create draft. Then light the main fire. The failure wasn't fatal. It was technical. Show me. They burned paper in the clean-out opening for 15 minutes. When the flue was warm, she rebuilt the main fire. This time, the smoke rose. It twisted through 43 feet of brick channels and slipped into the sky as a thin white line. Within an hour, the bricks were warm. Within 3, they were too hot to touch. The cabin climbed from 34 degrees to 58 and kept rising. At sunset, she let the fire die. At midnight, the cabin was still 52. At dawn, with 12 degrees outside, the interior held at 49.
1 fire, 2 hours of burning, 18 hours of heat. Her grandfather's knowledge had crossed an ocean and survived. Josiah came on November 7th. He pressed his palm to the warm bricks. The firebox held only ash. How long? Yesterday morning. He did the math in silence. 70% less wood than a cast iron stove would need. For the first time, he wondered if he had misjudged her. The real test came November 19th. 6 below by afternoon. 4 below by midnight. She fired the stove at dawn. 90 minutes of fierce heat. Then sealed it. By morning, 63 inside. By noon, 59. By midnight, 51. Outside, wind howled. Inside, she slept warm. The mathematics held. January arrived with teeth. The blizzard began January 14th, 1874. Snow thickened. Wind reached 40 miles per hour. By the second day, drifts buried the north wall to the roofline. She dug a tunnel just to open the door. By the third day, the temperature fell to 34 below zero. The cabin held at 52. The stove performed exactly as designed. But on the fourth day, she found the lean-to collapsed. 6 feet of snow buried her outer wood pile. She stood in the white silence and calculated. How much wood remained inside? How many firings she could manage? How long the storm might last? Then she turned back toward the warm bricks in the corner and did the math. She had 12 days of wood left at her current burn rate. If the blizzard ended within a week, she would be safe. If it stretched longer, she would have to ration. Colder nights. Higher risk. The lull in the storm lasted 2 hours. 2 miles east, Henrik Bunkstrom realized his own math was failing. His accessible wood would last 2 more days. The main pile was buried under 10 feet of drift. His wife, Ingrid, had given birth 6 weeks earlier. The baby would not survive a freezing cabin. Henrik tried to reach the wood pile during the call.
He made it 20 yards before the wind returned. He stumbled back half-blind, his hand and face frozen white. That night, they burned a chair. The next night, the table. By the 6th day, 2 days of fuel remained. Ingrid made the decision. She wrapped the baby in every blanket they owned and turned west, toward the cabin of the woman they had called cursed. "I will beg," she told Henrik. "I will not watch our children freeze." Elena heard the knock at 8 that evening, a faint pounding beneath the wind. She opened the door to find Ingrid in the drift, frost crusted on her lashes, a crying bundle in her arms. 3 children stood behind her like shadows. "Please," Ingrid croaked, "we have no wood. The children will die." 3 months earlier, she had refused Elena a shovel. Now she stood at her mercy. Elena looked at the woman who had called her cursed, at the children shivering blue, at the infants' weakening cries. Then she opened the door wider. Inside, quickly. It took 2 trips. They brought the children first, then Elena and Ingrid fought through the storm to retrieve Henrik, barely conscious, his frostbitten hand swollen and dark. By midnight, 7 people crowded the 14 by 16 cabin. Elena recalculated. 7 bodies, 1 stove, 6 days of wood at best. She said nothing of the numbers. Instead, she made everyone useful. Ingrid cooked. Sven, the eldest boy, learned the damper and the fire. On the 7th day, Sven approached her quietly. "The bricks you found smashed," he said. "That was me." She turned slowly. "My mother said you were cursed. I thought if your stove failed you would leave. I was trying to protect us." Elena studied the frightened 12-year-old. "There is no curse," she said gently. "Only fear, and fear makes people cruel." "I'm sorry." "I know." She handed him a split log. "Not too much. We want the fire hot, not large. Let me show you." For an hour she taught him thermal mass, airflow, efficient burn, knowledge instead of superstition. "My grandfather told me," she said, "what lives in your hands and head belongs to you forever." Sven looked at the stove, then at her. "Will you teach me more?" "Yes," she said. Outside, the wind rose again to 60 miles per hour. Temperature outside dropped to 38 degrees below zero. Henrik's fever broke, but his hand showed the blackening that meant dead tissue. He would lose at least 2 fingers, probably more. The pain was constant, and Elena had nothing to give him for it, except willow bark tea and distraction. She told him about her grandfather's stoves, about building a novide and watching the village transformed from scattered cold houses to a community of warmth,
about crossing the ocean with her parents and her new husband, carrying nothing but the clothes on their backs and knowledge in their heads. She told him about Even, how they had met in New York, two immigrants sharing a language and a dream, how they had come west chasing land and opportunity, how he had died in her arms while typhoid burned through him, and how she had spent the next 6 months learning what it meant to be truly alone. Henrik listened because listening kept his mind off the pain, but something changed in his expression as she talked. The suspicion that had been there when they first arrived, the lingering belief that perhaps the curse was real after all, gradually faded. In its place came something that looked like respect. "I am a sawmill man," he said during a lull in her narrative. "I know wood and I know tools. I have built houses and barns and furniture, but I have never seen anything like your stove. It is beyond anything I understood about heating. It is not beyond understanding. It is just different understanding. In America, you have much wood and little time. Your stoves are designed for that. Fast to build, easy to move. In Russia, we had less wood and more cold. Our stoves are designed for that instead. Could I build one if I had the knowledge?" Elena looked at his bandaged hand. "You will need help. But yes, the principles are not complicated. Mass, heat, time. Channel the smoke to extract the heat before it escapes. Let the mass store the heat and release it slowly. Any person can build this if they understand why each part matters." Henrik nodded slowly. "When this storm breaks, I would like to learn. When this storm breaks, I will teach you." The storm broke on the morning of the 10th day. Elena woke to silence. For the first time in nearly 2 weeks, the wind had stopped. Sunlight filtered through the oiled paper window coverings, golden and clean, illuminating a cabin full of sleeping forms. She rose carefully and made her way to the door. It resisted at first, packed against drifts that had formed in the night's final hours. She put her shoulder to it and pushed until it gave way, spilling her out into a world transformed. Snow covered everything. Drifts 15 to 20 feet high had reshaped the landscape into something alien and beautiful. The valley was silent except for the occasional crack of ice settling and the distant call of a crow. Elena stood in the doorway and breathed air that burned her lungs with its purity. She was alive. The Bergstroms were alive. Whatever had been destroyed or lost during the blizzard, these 7 people had survived. She had 3 days of wood remaining. It had been enough. Josiah Harwick organized the count on the 3rd day after the storm. The settlers emerged from their various shelters, blinking in the brilliant sunlight that now seemed almost cruel after so many days of darkness. They gathered at the general store, a ragged collection of survivors comparing notes on damage and loss. The news came in pieces. The Hendersons, a family of 4 who had claimed land near the valley floor, had run out of fuel on day 6. By the time anyone reached them, 2 children and their mother had frozen to death. The father survived but would never be the same. The elderly couple, the Petersons, who had settled near the creek, had inadequate shelter. Their cabin roof had collapsed under the weight of snow. They were found together in bed, frozen in each other's arms. 2 men had died trying to reach neighbors for help. One had made it halfway before the wind brought him down. The other had left his cabin on day 4 and was found 300 yards away, so covered in snow that he looked like a natural feature of the landscape. In total, 11 people dead in a 100-meter radius, 11 lives ended by a blizzard that had lasted exactly 10 days, and 7 people alive in a 14 by 16 cabin, heated by a stove that everyone had said was impossible. The story spread through the valley like wildfire in spring. The widow Morozova, the cursed woman, the black widow that everyone avoided, had not only survived, but had saved an entire family. Henrik Bergstrom, his hands still bandaged and his face still bearing the scars of frostbite, told everyone who would listen about the stove that burned 1 fire a day, the stove that had kept 7 people warm through the worst blizzard anyone could remember. Thaddeus Whitmore wrote a letter to the territorial newspaper. He included technical drawings he had made during his observations in November, calculations of fuel efficiency, and a detailed account of the blizzard survival. He was careful to note that Elena's design achieved approximately 73% fuel reduction compared to conventional cast iron stoves. This efficiency differential meant survival versus death, he wrote. Mrs. Morozova's Russian masonry heater represents engineering knowledge that American settlers would benefit from adopting. The letter was published in February. By March, 17 homesteaders in the Gallatin Valley had approached Elena about building similar stoves. She charged $12 per stove for her consulting and labor. It was enough to pay off her debts and establish legitimate claim to the cabin. It was enough to transform her from charity case to respected craftsman. It was enough to prove that knowledge properly applied could overcome any label that fear invented. Reverend Ezekiel Crane requested to speak at the first Sunday service after the storm. The congregation gathered in the meeting house, survivors of the worst winter anyone could remember, still wearing black for the 11 who had not survived. The Reverend stood before them with his thin face and thin voice, and surprised everyone. "I owe this congregation an apology," he began. "And more than this congregation, I owe Mrs. Morozova an apology." A murmur rippled through the assembled settlers. Apologies from preachers were rare enough to be noticeable. "I told Mrs. Morozova in October that her plan showed prideful rejection of help. I told her that God expected us to recognize our limitations. I believed that a woman alone could not survive a Montana winter. And I counseled her to accept what I assumed was inevitable failure." He paused and looked directly at Elena, who sat in the back row with the Bergstrom family. "I was wrong. Not just factually wrong, but spiritually wrong. True pride is not attempting difficult things. True pride is assuming that our limited experience represents universal truth. True humility is recognizing that wisdom can come from unexpected sources and foreign traditions. The congregation was utterly silent. God's truth does not speak only English, the Reverend continued, and God's blessings do not flow only through channels we recognize and approve. Mrs. Morozova built a warm house. She built it with knowledge from a grandfather in Russia, knowledge that saved her life and the lives of the Bergstrom family. If that is not God's work, then I do not understand God's work at all. He stepped down from the pulpit and walked to where Elena sat. He extended his hand. "Forgive me," he said. "I should have offered help instead of judgment." Elena took his hand. "There is nothing to forgive, Reverend. You spoke from experience. I spoke from different experience. Neither of us was wrong to trust what we knew. You were more right," he said simply.
And I will remember that the next time I am tempted to counsel someone to accept their limitations. The congregation released its hell breath. Something had shifted in the room, some collective weight of judgment and fear lifting. The widow Morozova was no longer the cursed woman. She was the woman who had built the stove that saved lives. It was a different kind of reputation, and it changed everything. Josiah Harwick added a line of fire bricks to his store inventory and started keeping construction diagrams for the stoves. He had stopped suggesting that widows move to Helena if they had skills and determination. The frontier could be survived without a husband's labor. It required different strategies, but different was not impossible. He told Elena as much when she came to pay off her credit account in March. "You proved something this winter," he said, counting out her coins and marking the ledger. "Not just about stoves, about what is possible. I proved what my grandfather knew 50 years ago. You proved it here. That is different." Josiah closed the legend and met her eyes. "My daughter, Cordelia, you remember what I told you back in October. The child came in August, a healthy girl. But Cordelia needs more than just survival now. She needs a future." "What are you asking?" "I thought about sending her to Helena, thought about having her give up the child, thought about all the things a respectable man is supposed to think in these situations." Josiah's voice hardened with old anger and new resolution. "But I watched you this winter. I watched you take something everyone said was impossible and make it work through nothing but knowledge and determination. I started thinking maybe I was asking the wrong questions about Cordelia. What question should you be asking? Not how do I hide her shame? How do I give her tools to survive?" Josiah rubbed his jaw. "She is smart, my Cordelia, smarter than her brothers were before the fever took them. I wonder if you might teach her some of what you know. Not the stove building necessarily, but the other things. How to read plans, how to calculate materials, how to look at a problem like someone who means to solve it." Lena thought about her grandfather teaching a girl in a society that did not value girls' knowledge. She thought about the chain of learning stretching back through generations, each link forged by someone willing to teach and someone willing to learn. "Send her to me," Elena said. "I will teach her what I can." Cordelia Harwick arrived at Elena's cabin on a morning in early September, when the aspens were beginning to turn gold and the first hints of autumn sharp in the air. She was 17, with a month-old daughter strapped to her chest, and defiant in the way that frightened people often are. "My father says you can teach me things," she said. "I do not know what things. I am not good at much." Elena handed her a pencil and a scrap of paper. "Draw me a square." Cordelia shifted the baby and drew a square. "Now divide it into 4 equal parts." Cordelia drew lines, creating 4 smaller squares. "Now draw me the same square, but with channels running through it, like a maze. The path must touch every part of the square before reaching the exit." Cordelia frowned, but she bent over the paper and began drawing. Her first attempt was awkward. Her second was better. By her 5th attempt, she had created something that resembled a simple flue path. "You are good at thinking spatially," Elena said. "That is useful for many things. Building, planning, organizing. The world is full of problems that need people who can see solutions in their heads before they build them with their hands. I thought you were going to teach me to cook or sew. Can you not already cook and sew?" Cordelia nodded reluctantly. "Then I will teach you things you do not already know. In Russia, my grandfather said that a woman's hand should be able to do anything a man's hands can do. Not because she must do men's work, but because she must not be helpless when there are no men around." Something shifted in Cordelia's expression. The defiant faded, replaced by something that looked like hope. "My daughter will need a mother who can survive," she said quietly. "Your daughter will need a mother who can build. Build a life, build a home,
build a future that does not depend on anyone else's approval or protection. Elena handed her another piece of paper. Now draw me a rectangle divided into 7 chambers connected by a single continuous path. This is how the smoke moves through a Russian stove. If you can draw it, you can begin to understand it. If you understand it, you can build it. If you build it, you can teach it. Knowledge passes through hands like heat through bricks. It only stops if everyone stops teaching. Cordelia bent over the paper and began to draw. Spring came slowly to the Gallatin Valley that year. The snow melted in stages, revealing the damage the blizzard had wrought. Collapsed outbuildings, dead livestock, damaged fences, and broken equipment. The survivors spent the months of April and May rebuilding, and Elena's stove-building business was part of that reconstruction. Henrik Bergstrom was her first student and her first apprentice. His right hand still worked, though 2 fingers of his left were gone, and he threw himself into learning with the desperate energy of a man making amends. He built 3 stoves for neighbors that spring, working from Elena's designs and under her supervision. Each one worked. Each one proved the principle again. In Sweden, we have similar stoves, Henrik told Elena as they worked on the 4th installation. My grandmother had one, but I never understood how it worked. I thought it was some kind of old country magic. Magic is just knowledge we have not explained yet, Elena said. Your grandmother's stove worked for the same reasons mine works. Physics does not care about borders. Thaddeus Whitmore continued documenting the stoves as they spread through the valley. He corresponded with engineers in the East, sharing drawings and efficiency calculations. The principle behind the Russian stove was not uniquely Russian. He learned Korean and Shi heating used similar thermal mass concepts. Chinese Kang stoves combined sleeping platforms with masonry heat storage. Finnish counterflow stoves employed labyrinthine flue paths for maximum heat extraction. What these traditions share, he wrote in one of his letters, is emergence in climates where fuel is scarce and cold is deadly. They represent centuries of refinement by cultures where winter survival was not optional. American settlers have much to learn from this accumulated wisdom. Summer arrived, and with it the first anniversary of Yvonne's death. She stood by his grave, on a June morning when the wildflowers were blooming, and the valley was green with new growth. She had not been able to visit during the winter, had not been able to clear the snow from his marker, or leave the tokens of remembrance that custom required. Now she stood in the sunshine and spoke to him quietly. I built your house into something they will remember, she said, not just for the winter, for all the winters after. Your name is not on it, but your belief is. You believed I could survive here. You were right. She placed wildflowers on the grave and stood for a long moment in silence. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it had transformed into something she could carry. Not a weight, but a foundation. Not an ending, but a beginning. I will build more, she told him. I will teach more. And someday maybe someone will tell the story of what we started here. They will not know your name, but they will know what we did. She walked back to the cabin with the sun on her face, and the future stretching out before her like the valley itself, washed in green and full of possibility. By 1876, variants of the Russian masonry heater appeared throughout Montana Territory and into Wyoming. They rarely looked identical. Each builder adapted the concept to local materials, cabin sizes, and personal understanding. Some work better than others. Elena's original design remained the reference standard because she understood not just the construction, but the underlying principles. She had taught 23 people to build by then. Henrik Bergstrom, Cordelia Harwick, who had proven to have genuine talent for spatial reasoning and had built 2 stoves herself with her daughter watching from a basket nearby. Thaddeus Whitmore, who approached it as an engineering problem and solved it with mathematical precision. A dozen others who came seeking knowledge and left with hands that could shape warmth from brick and clay. Sven Bergstrom grew up in those years, transforming from a frightened boy who had tried to destroy Elena's work into a young man who understood why that work mattered. He helped his father build stoves. He helped Elena teach new students. He was the one who started keeping records of each installation, documenting what worked and what did not, creating a body of knowledge that would outlast them all. Why do you record everything? Elena asked him once. Because you said knowledge dies if people stop teaching.
But teachers die too. Records do not. If I write it down, someone 100 years from now can learn what we learned. They do not have to start from nothing. Elena looked at the young man who had grown from the boy who vandalized her bricks, at the careful drawings and precise measurements in his notebooks, at the legacy taking shape in ink and paper. Your grandfather would be proud of you, she said. Sven looked confused. I never knew my grandfather. I meant my grandfather. He taught me. I taught you. That makes him your grandfather too, in the ways that matter. The chain of learning stretching back through generations, each link forged by someone willing to teach, each link strengthened by someone willing to learn. Cordelia gave birth to a daughter she named Elena in August of 1874. The girl grew up surrounded by blueprints and brick samples, learning to read construction diagrams before she learned to read storybooks. She asked questions constantly, and her mother answered them with the patience of someone who remembered what it meant to be told she was not good at much. In 1892, Elena Hardwick became the first woman from the Gallatin Valley to attend university. She studied engineering. Her thesis was on thermal mass heating systems in extreme climates. The dedication page contained a single line for the two Elenas who taught me that knowledge is the one thing no one can take. But the chain of knowledge passing through hands like heat through bricks. The winter of 1876 was harsh, but fewer people died. The winter of 77 was worse, but the valley endured. The masonry heaters that Elena had introduced and others had built and improved kept families warm through blizzards that would have been death sentences a decade earlier. The mathematics had changed. What had been impossible was now merely difficult. What had been survival was becoming prosperity. Elena sold the cabin in 1889 and moved to Bozeman to be closer to the community that had grown up around her work. She was 51 years old and had seen the valley transform from isolated homesteads to established ranches. The masonry heater she had built in 17 desperate days had warmed her home for 15 winters without significant maintenance. She fired it one last time in February of that year, during a cold snap that hit 26 degrees below zero. The ritual she had performed 1,000 times. Prime the chimney, light the kindling, feed the fire, let it burn hot for 2 hours, seal the damper, wait for the bricks to do their work. By evening, with the fire long dead, the temperature inside held at 54 degrees, while the valley froze outside. The same knowledge her grandfather had passed to her across an ocean in a lifetime. The same stubborn refusal to let the world decide her fate. The cabin changed hands 3 times over the next 50 years. Each owner maintained the stove because the stove worked. Each winter they fired it the way Elena had taught, the way her grandfather taught her, the way generations of Russian Petniki had taught their children for 400 years. In 1939, the last regular owner donated the cabin to the Montana Heritage Society. The stove was inspected and found to be structurally sound, despite 70 years of use. The mortar Elena had mixed from clay and sand and grass held firm. The flue channels remained clear. The fire bricks showed wear, but no failure. It has not been fired in 70 years now. The cabin is a museum, a preserved moment from a time when survival required knowledge and determination, and the willingness to learn from anyone who had answers, regardless of where they came from or what language they spoke. You can visit if you want. The rangers will show you the stove that the widow Morozova built in 17 days of desperate preparation. They will explain the physics and the history. They will tell you about the blizzard of 1874 and the 11 people who died and the 7 who survived in a 14 by 6 foot cabin heated by 4,000 pounds of brick and clay. But they cannot show you what matters most. They cannot show you the grandfather in Novgorod teaching a girl what should have been taught to sons. They cannot show you the woman standing in a land office receiving notice that everything she had built was being taken away. They cannot show you the moment she decided to build anyway. They cannot show you the fear she felt that first night in the cabin, or the determination that carried her through 17 days of work, or the relief when the smoke finally rose through the channels and the bricks grew warm. They cannot show you the door opening on the 6th night of the blizzard, when a woman who had called her cursed stood begging for shelter. They cannot show you the choice to help anyway. That is what the stove cannot preserve. The human moments that made the technical achievement possible. The courage and fear and stubbornness and grace that shape brick into survival. But you can imagine it. Stand in that cabin in the silence of a museum that was once a home. Put your hand on the bricks that Elena shaped from creek clay 150 years ago. They are cool now, have been cool for decades. But they remember heat. They remember survival. They remember what happens when knowledge crosses borders, and someone pays attention. The frontier is gone, but the principle remains. When conventional wisdom something cannot be done, maybe you are just asking the wrong people. Somewhere, someone has already solved your problem. You just need to know where to look.
and be humble enough to learn from them. Elena Morozova looked to Novgorod when Montana said she would freeze. The answer was always there. She just had to build it. If this story has meant something to you, I want to thank you for staying until the end. Stories like Elena's deserve to be remembered, not as quaint historical curiosities, but as reminders that knowledge and determination can overcome obstacles that seem impossible. The frontier was ruthless in its honesty. Bad ideas failed visibly. Good ideas survived and spread. That kind of honesty is rare now, but it is worth preserving. If you want to help keep these stories alive, please subscribe to this channel and share this video with someone who might need to hear that impossible is just another word for not yet figured out. Elena's grandfather could never have imagined Montana, but his knowledge traveled there anyway, carried by a granddaughter he had trusted with his life's work. And that knowledge saved lives in a language and landscape he never knew. That is the power of teaching. That is the power of learning. That is the chain that connects us all, across borders and generations, and oceans of time. Build something worth passing on. Someone you will never meet might need it someday. Elena Morozova's story proves that knowledge is the only wealth no one can steal. Facing isolation and a deadly winter, she used her heritage to build what others deemed impossible. Her Russian stove did more than defy the cold. It warmed the hearts of those who shunned her. By saving the neighbors who called her cursed, Elena proved that competence and kindness are the only answers to prejudice. When the world says something is impossible, look to your roots. The solution might already exist, waiting for you to build.